So hello everybody, we're dealing with, this is a continuation of the last couple of videos that dealt with the early stages of the Reformation, where Martin Luther actually developed a theology based around the idea of justification by faith alone. And that created a conflict with the church, naturally enough, in the years, the following years, 1518, 1519, and by 1520, Martin Luther had developed a strong ideology, and he wrote 3 books that year, what I covered in a previous video. Those 3 books actually sort of outline his overall theology in terms of condemning the church, freedom of the Christian, and also in relation to the German nobility. And this is what we're dealing with here today, actually, because the German nobility by the late 20s, by about 26, 27, were beginning to take over church lands. And Henry VIII was in a situation where he was running, he was King of England at this stage. He became king actually at quite a young age. In 1509, he was a very strong king, a strong pro-Catholic king for the first few years. In fact, himself and Thomas More, his chancellor and his great advisor, wrote a book or wrote a thesis in defence of the actual Catholic Church in 1521. At the same time as actually Luther was actually challenging the church at Worms in that same year, in 1521. It was a very pivotal year. And King Henry VIII was very, very far away from Luther at that stage. In fact, he was making the complete opposite argument, a very strong Catholic argument, in favour of the Mass, in favour of transubstantiation, the Sacraments and all that. The very thing that actually Luther was defying. But that was 21. As it went through the 20s though, Henry began to develop sort of personal problems in the sense that his wife wasn't able to actually give him a male heir to the throne. He was extremely anxious to ensure that there wouldn't be a civil war after he had finished as king himself, died or killed or whatever. So he wanted to make sure that there would be a stable nobility after him. And the best way to do that, of course, is to have a direct son to take over the throne. So he was anxious to get an annulment on that basis. And he was also, to a certain extent, theologically entitled to one, or it could be argued that he was, because he was married actually to, she was married to Catherine of Aragon. She was married to his older brother, Henry's older brother. So on that basis, there is a scripture verse, I can't think of it exactly, but it's in the Old Testament. There is a scripture verse which says that thou shalt not marry your brother's wife. And on that basis, Henry was looking for an annulment from the Pope. The Pope's hands, to a certain extent, though, were tied, because the Pope actually didn't want to offend the great Emperor Charles V, because Charles V was related to Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was actually Charles V's aunt. So the Pope didn't want to offend him, and as a result was dragging his feet a bit in relation to this annulment business, was reluctant to give it, and by the late 20s, Henry VIII was beginning to cool towards Rome. He wanted to get an official, proper annulment, and that wasn't forthcoming, mainly because of the political reasons, possibly for theological reasons as well. I'm not quite sure about that, but one way or the other anyway, he actually, the Pope refused to give Henry VIII. That became rather definite by the end of the 20s, about 29. This is actually the same year as 29 was the same year that Luther actually met Zwingli, and they found that the Reformation movement was splitting apart. Some years are quite pivotal actually in terms of the Reformation. I noticed that 1509 was the year that Henry VIII came to the throne. He was only 18 years of age, and that was the same year that John Kavanagh was born actually in that year, a very influential theologian from the mid-30s onwards. He wrote a great book in 36, The Institutes of the Christian Life, and that was very influential in the decades ahead. So by the end of the 20s, of course, King Henry VIII has become somewhat disillusioned with the Pope. Very disillusioned because he can't get out of the marriage that he's involved in. He wants to make sure that there's a male heir, and that's actually only part of the reason, though, that he's beginning to cool towards the papacy. There was always a strain between the English monarchy and the Roman Empire, and especially the the Pope in Rome. It goes back to King John 500 years here or there, actually, around the year 1050 or that. So by the early 30s and even the late 20s, Henry VIII is beginning, and his advisors are beginning to look at what's happening in Germany. And what's happening in Germany is that the nobility in Germany, certain nobles in particular, are very aggressive in terms of taking Luther's advice to reform the church. Luther, by inviting them in with his book in 1521, he writes an appeal to the German nobility, and what he's basically asking them to do is to reform the church. The nobles, though, see that in a different light, whether they share his theology of faith alone or not. They see this as an absolute ideal opportunity to actually take over billions and billions of pounds worth of land. Because one thing that Germany and England have in common at this stage is that the church owns about 20 to 25% of the land. These huge bishoprics, and some of these bishops are bigger and more powerful and more wealthy than landlords. And some of them own entire shires in England, and in Germany the equivalent of a county, or in some cases almost a province. So there's monumental wealth involved as well. And Henry VIII, by around the year 1530, is beginning to recognise that this is a golden opportunity that will never come again for the crown to greatly enrich itself. So Henry has 2 or 3 incentives here. Number 1, he wants to get out of a marriage. Number 2, he wants to enrich himself and bring a lot of loyal nobles in behind him, sell off this cheap land and have rents coming into the crown for decades or centuries ahead. And number 3, he wants to actually achieve a degree of greater independence from Rome and from the Roman Empire generally. He wants to protect English sovereignty, and this goes back to him, and it's actually still very much in the air in terms of English nationalism even to this day. And 34 is the year that he actually makes all this official. He passes he pushes through Parliament an act called the Act of Supremacy. That's in 1534. That's a very, very important act because he basically liquidates all the monastery land. There's billions of pounds worth of land, at least 65 to 70 billion pounds worth of land involved. And he takes over that from the church. And 34 is also a very significant year in that it's actually the year that Martin Luther is in Germany. And that's the year, it takes him 12 years from 22 to 34 to translate the Old Testament. And as he goes through it, he finds that there's certain texts that don't quite match his own theory or theology of faith alone. So he doesn't remove those books from the Bible, but he does actually classify them in a separate section, which he calls the Apocryphal. And that actually means that they are not regarded by Luther as scripture, even though they were always considered scripture for the 1100 years. The Bible didn't come into existence until the year 415 officially it came in, but there was 3 or 4 church meetings before that, council meetings, that actually classified the 73 books as scripture, but Luther downgraded 7 of them. So the same year that Henry VIII was becoming king or head of the Church of England, Luther was actually downgrading a part of the Bible that didn't agree with his ideology. So that is actually what happened in the mid-30s. England is very gradually, moving away from the actual Catholic faith. King Henry VIII is reluctant to actually make too many moves because a lot of the stuff that's actually coming from, in the theological sense, that's coming from Germany, he doesn't really agree with. In his heart of hearts, Henry VIII is very much a Catholic in terms of doctrine. He believes in the Mass, he believes in transubstantiation, he believes in basically all the doctrines, confession, the whole lot. So he actually just rejects the authority of the Pope, but theologically he's very much a Catholic. It's just a question of an opportunity to get a divorce and get great enrichment in terms of church lands. But apart from that, Henry has no problem with the rest of the Catholic doctrine. If he met Luther, say for instance, around the late 30s or 1540, they probably couldn't speak the same language, but even if they did, they'd be miles apart in terms of theology. Henry was never really part of the Reformed faith. He was a Catholic all his life, and the actual gradual change didn't really happen very much until actually his son came in, and he was only a child. That was Edward VI. That was in 1547. Yeah, so Henry was on the throne for 38 years from 09 to 47. So Edward came in. Then after that, he was there for only 6 years, from the age of 9 to the age of 15. But it was during that reign that actually England really moved from being a Catholic country to being a Protestant country. Actually, in 1539, before I go forward to the Edward thing, in 1539 there was a lot of dispute, a lot of instability in the late 30s in England, because there was the monastery lands was being transferred from papal control to the crown, and various different nobles were beginning to actually enrich themselves on the basis of this cheap land, which is a brilliant once-in-a-life opportunity. It was part of the reason that some of these people joined the Reform movement, because there was actually huge material benefits, and it's something that's often overlooked in all these arguments about theology. But in 1539, Henry VIII, in order to stabilise the situation, introduced what's known as the 6 Articles. And these 6 Articles are an indication of what Henry actually believed. They're very, very, very much pro-Catholic. For instance, the Mass is protected. The whole idea of transubstantiation, which is the heart and soul of the Mass, that's protected within the 6 Articles. The whole idea of priests not being allowed to marry, priest celibacy, that's protected. And the whole idea of confessions, these are actually the whole reconciliation when a person commits mortal sin and that sort of thing. So these things by the late 30s, 39, are actually very much part of Henry's theology, insofar as one can understand his theology. He imposed it into these 6 Articles and wanted to stabilise the country around that, and did so during his life. There was other people trying to promote more reformed ideas in order to ensure that there was no reversion to the Catholic religion, because there was monumental amounts of wealth to be lost if the actual country did revert back to the Catholic religion and the Pope was regarded again as being the owner of these lands. That would be a colossal loss to the various different nobles and royal advisors as well. So there was this practical reason for moving towards the Reform movement, as well as, of course, some people as well that actually did believe in all the theology attached to it. That can't be underestimated. There was actually martyrs on both sides. The side of the Catholic Church, there was 2 people in the mid-30s. One was Thomas More. He was a great advisor to the king. One of the things he said towards the end was that he was actually the king's great servant, and he would serve the king and serve God, but he'd serve God first. That was one of his last statements. I'm not sure if it was his statement just before he died or in the last week or 2 of his life, but John Fisher as well, of course, gave up his life rather than agree to have King Henry VIII as king of the church. Because even to this day, like, the argument that a king should be at the head of a church is, from a theological point of view, an embarrassment, really, like, to think that somebody that is a politician is also at the head of a church. It's crazy, really, but that's what happened in Europe. That was necessary in order to enforce religion. Of course, the American experience was very different. In America, people went along with nothing but their Bible in a lot of cases, and their families and villages and towns and out in the prairie and places like that. They developed their own Christian theology. But in Europe, it's a very different experience. That's why there's so many wars, because these territories were in conflict with each other. Some was Protestant, some were Catholic, and all the rest of it, various different alliances, military alliances. And eventually by the 1550s, there was actually in 1555, the 3 5s, there was a peace treaty called the Treaty of Augsburg. And at that treaty, it was decided finally that the people would adopt the religion of the actual king or queen or government of that territory. So This goes back to the idealistic notion that Martin Luther had 30 years earlier, that people would read the Bible and they'd all decide for themselves to join his particular ideology, his particular theology, that faith alone and all that sort of stuff. To a certain extent that went by the wayside by the mid-50s because the treaty in 1555, the Treaty of Augsburg, actually gave the right to the various kings and queens and rulers of Europe generally to impose. So it wasn't so much that people had any choice in the matter. They were forced to join the Reformed faith in many cases. Other rulers stayed Catholic, like say, for instance, in France and Italy and Ireland, and these countries remained Catholic, and others joined the Reform movement. So that's basically the difference between, or at least it's some of the difference between European Christianity, even to this day, and American Christianity, which tends to be more confrontational with itself, more debate, all that sort of thing. But people in Europe are reluctant to debate Christianity because of the fact that it's a very painful, difficult history. A lot of people lost their lives in the process of sorting all this out. So I'll deal with that a bit more detail in the next video, and we'll leave it at that then. That's it for today, and thank you very much for watching, and I hope to actually do one more video on this overall theme, the Reformation, and the difference between how the religion developed, the Christian religion developed in Europe and in America, and I'll do sort of a summary video next week. If you'd like to join that, please subscribe to the channel. This is Enda Benson, and goodbye and thanks for watching.